So Conner Habib is here today, and not necessarily in his porn capacity, for those who are asking. I said not necessarily. He's here to give us all a pleasure rush today, as he asks us to consider what sexual health would look like if we enacted it in our daily lives, outside of the bedroom, from an emotional, mental, and cultural sphere. Today is actually the kickoff to the Sexo campaign and the Sexo exhibit, which you guys will hear all about, and you probably got the flyer for it on your chairs, but it's an exhibit that blends bathhouse, bedroom, back alley, and forum into a three-dimensional environment where people ask questions, speak out, and create new conversations about sexual realities in our communities. It was inspired by a controversial sex-positive campaign that was launched in Philadelphia in 1992. So Sexo 21 years later commences an ongoing social movement about sexual frankness, pleasure, and community health. And so we hope that you'll all join us here for the opening event on April 12th in William Way, just right up there from 6 to 8. So the reason that we're all here, I'll stop talking, is to see and hear Conner Habib. Conner Habib is a writer, a gay porn star, and lecturer. Each week he hosts the Ask the Expert Sex and Relationship Advice web show on Logo TV's NowNext.com. And his work has appeared in Salon.com, The Advocate, Andrew Sullivan's The Dish, Full Stop, The Good Men Project, Best Sex Writing 2013, and more. He's appeared in nearly 150 adult films and has won Grabby and Gay Vienna Awards for his work. He lectures across the U.S. on porn, culture, sex, and spirituality, and was the first gay porn star to speak at New York's Museum of Modern Art. His book, Everything You're Not Supposed to Know About Sex, will be published by Disinformation Books in 2014. He lives in San Francisco, where he runs a Rudolf Steiner spirituality and science discussion group. So, you know, he's accomplished. So please join me in welcoming Conner Habib.
Hi. I'm going to talk a little bit about myself, and then I'm going to tell you a little bit about myself, and then I'm going to give you some notions I'm working with when it comes to sexual health. Specifically, I'm going to go through 4 principles, and then you're all going to talk to each other, and that's going to sort of bleed into a Q&A, or just a discussion. So about me, as if, at least it didn't say enough. I got here because I decided to engage with sex in a certain way in my life. It's funny the things you get to ask to speak about when you have lots of sex and when you do it publicly and openly. So for me, sex has always been my way through the world in a sense. I mean, aside from the fact that I was brought here by sex, which is something that we all share in common. I mean, you couldn't be sitting here if 2 people didn't come together and decide to do it, which is kind of awesome. We all have the same creation story in that sense. Besides that, sex has been like this thread through life for me. In a way, it's a way of life, and a lot of sex workers, people who do sex work, are in this position. So when I talk about sexual health, I want to say that my perspective comes from cutting my path through life, through looking deeply into sex, my own sexual experiences, of the sexual experiences of other people, and part of that has been putting myself in a position where people are confronted with that when they meet me, where they want to talk about sex with me, or they're thinking about sex just because they've met me, not because I'm sexy, I don't mean it like that, but I mean because of my job, because of what I do. So you can do this with anything in life. As you can imagine, humor would be sort of a way through life for a comedian, you know, somebody who would find the absurdity in everything. They make their way through the world by using jokes and absurdity. Or you can do it with a focused scientific viewpoint. If you're really into evolution, everything seems to link toward that. If you look at a particular, it can become your worldview. So sex, in a sense, is my current worldview. It wasn't always, and it probably won't always be, because I get tired of things sometimes. I don't know that I'll get tired of this, but I get tired of things sometimes. And you know, maybe I'll take on a different lens, but The interesting thing to me about sex in particular is that not a lot of people take it on as their sort of worldview. Sex is a separate part of life. So you have the rest of your life, and then you jerk off, or you get laid, or you masturbate, whatever, and that's somehow supposed to be segregated from it. Like, here's the rest of your life, and here's sex. So why do I say all this? Because everything I'm talking about today, it doesn't come from like a psychology degree. Not that I don't value those, but it comes more from trying to take sex on its own terms. So to try to let everything else in the world find its relationship to sex, instead of making sex sort of servant to something, instead of making it just be a function of something else. So I'm not like, I'm not gathering information. This isn't like a TED Talk where I like gather information and spit out some cute theory, right? Like, that's not, I'm not gathering evidence exactly. That's not exactly it. Instead, it's me sort of respecting sex as a mystery, something that has its own validity and its own life. And actually, I offer that as sort of the guiding principle and the first point of sexual health that I wanted to give to you. And so you have these little sheets that came in a pile of sheets, I guess. And you'll use those later, but you'll see the first word on there should be mystery. And that's just so you remember. And then the other ones that have more space we'll talk about a little bit more. But what do I mean by mystery? I mean that sex is its own world. It's so complex that it's its own world, and it can teach us about all the other worlds and aspects of being a human. And so that's my first and one of my deepest and my guiding principle when it comes to sex as sort of a worldview, that we can learn more from sex about the world than we can even learn about sex itself. It's a mystery in that sense. So what has sex taught me about health and therefore sexual health? What attitudes is listening to my sexual experience and the sexual experience of others and cultures, this whole culture's sexual experience taught me? Well, as you imagine, when you take sex on as your lens, you start to see it everywhere in many aspects of our experience, and you discover sex as this really complex matrix of a lot of forces. And when that happens, you start realizing, you start seeing the stark relief of the current cultural conversation that's going on about sex. So this talk is called Beyond Our Bodies because I know I'm going against the current and the current cultural conversation about sex, which is more and more about the body. And this is true even about the sex positive movement. Which is, so what do I mean? Well, sex is definitely about our bodies, obviously. But it's becoming more and more about that as the sort of scientific and materialistic worldview gets absorbed. So science turns everything into bodies. Science is extremely objectifying. So people like to say that pornography is an objectifying force, but it's got nothing on science. Science is the most objectifying thing in the world. It turns everything into matter and motion. And chemicals and that sort of stuff. I mean, I'm sure you've heard these things about love, like, well, this is the first 3 months you have these chemicals going off in your brain, and that's why you fall in love, like that sort of stuff. And it has those kinds of concerns about sex, too. And so even when we're sex positive, when we talk about sex, we often mean our bodies. We're like, make sure you wear a condom. Make sure you go get tested for STDs. Make sure you go to the gynecologist to make sure nothing's wrong with you. And that's good. I mean, that's really important. And I think a lot of people are doing great work with that kind of stuff. It's not my concern quite as much. I'm definitely concerned with it, but I don't talk about it that much. Because is it the whole picture of sex? And more importantly, can it actually give us a picture of sexual health? I mean, it can give us a picture of disease pretty easily. It can give us a picture of pathology pretty easily. We know how to transmit STDs and how to treat them, that sort of stuff. But what about health? Is health just the absence of disease? So if we follow that line of thinking, a lot of times all we really learn about health is the absence of it. We define health as the absence of disease. So we've created a picture of sexual health only through its negative. And because of that, we end up reinforcing the negative view. It's like every time we think about sex or talk about it in a positive way, you know, even wear a condom, of course, is a message that I support, but even that embedded in it is a shadow. This is interesting to me. Health in general is tricky in that way. We have real trouble defining what health is. So health has the same root word as wholeness. You guys might know this. So thinking about health is like, what does wholeness mean? I might think I'm healthy when I go to the gym in the morning or when I eat well, but the fact of the matter is I spend 8 hours a day sitting in front of a computer or holding a book. That's what I spend most of my awake time doing. So what does it mean to be healthy in those moments, during those 8 hours a day? And the same is true for sexual health. What does it mean to be healthy, not just in relation to our body and that moment that we have sex, and our genitals and our throats and our butts and our immune systems and all that sort of stuff, but during the rest of our lives? Because more time is spent considering sex and feeling sex and encountering sex and finding out about sexual images and all that sort of stuff than having sex. Unless you're really, really lucky, and then good for you. So, then next time, you give the next talk. It seems to know more about it than I do. So how can we understand sex during these other times, and also when we're having sex, how can we understand sex as something that's not just a body, that's happening to a body? So that's the second thing I learned about sex, and that's the second thing, you know, on your sheet there, which is, you know, it's not just our bodies, and to see it only as our bodies is define it by its negative. The body is important, but you can't form a whole picture of sexual health that way. Now, as a porn actor, you know that sex can't just be the body, because when you're working, you have to think about your body. You have to do all kinds of weird shit. You have to sort of like keep your leg up here, and you know there's a camera right here, and then there's lights around you, and there's people sort of yelling commands, and you also have to think about the viewer. You have to think about how somebody's going to encounter the scene, and at the same time, you have to sort of dip back in your body and have a sexual experience, or you can't stay hard and you can't come. So you start to see that it's all these weird factors, and doing that act of being in porn has sort of shown me that there are all these different principles at work. And then the weird thing is you start to see that sex is like that off camera as well. It's a capacity that you start to gain from being in porn. Not all porn actors get this, and it's not a prescription. It's not like people should get this. I'm just saying this is a capacity that showed up in me after making probably way too many movies. So sex is this matrix of different forces. And what are those forces? What are these elements that I'm saying come together to form a whole sexual picture? Because I want to understand sex in a real way. And those are the items that are on your sheet that have some space there. Body, growth, the feeling, and the thinking. They're all intertwined, but in order to talk about them, I mean, honestly, it's just too hard to talk about them all intertwined. So I separate them to make it easier for me to talk with you about them. The divisions, in a sense, are arbitrary because they're just an organizing principle that helps me understand, helps me talk to you. But in another sense, they're very real. They're like what sex looks like when you hold it in a certain light. So when a certain kind of perspective hits sex, this is the aspect that you can focus on. This is the aspect you can see. So also, if you know me, you would know that I've sort of stolen these principles from 19th century occultism. But since you don't know me, it's going to sound perfectly reasonable. And I've changed the name so they all sound totally acceptable. So I want to talk about each of these terms and also how sexual health applies to them. So the body, I've already talked about, and we're not going to talk about the standard bodily idea of sexual health that much today. Like wear a condom, that sort of thing. The second thing we have here is growth. So what do I mean when I say the growth principle of sexual health? I'm going to talk about this one a little more than I talk about the others. Well, I think if you picture a plant, you'll get sort of a good picture of what I mean here. our sexual development and who we are sexually follows this sort of growth progression that a plant goes through as it sort of pokes up through the ground and unfolds into leaves, and then gradually the petals form and then they open up. Our sexuality builds on itself, so who we are and the sexual patterns and habits we engage in today inform our sexual life tomorrow. So we have this whole developing and unfolding sexuality in our lives. It's not just the same thing over and over, although we do hit little eddies of patterns in our sexuality. And this progression is different for everyone, but then there are some similarities and overlaps too. So we all start off with childhood sexuality. I don't say asexuality because I don't think kids are asexual, but I think their consciousness is so different that it's not instructive to talk about it in the same way that we talk about adult sexuality. They're not in their bodies in the same way, they're not perceiving the world in the same way, so that's sort of as if you've planted a seed in the ground and the ground is right there. You know there's something there, but you don't know what it's going to look like, you don't know what kind of plant it is, you don't know what's going to come up and come out of that, just from looking at the ground. So then at adolescence, if you remember, as I do quite intensely, and sometimes just a little before sex starts to wake up in us and we get to see that little sprout, poking out, and we emerge from that foundation, and that's where these contours really start to show up. It could be our first stirrings of sexual identity, it could be noticing our gender in a really intense way in relation to others, it could be having intense sexual experiences. I remember the moment it happened for me. So I was 15, and I was at the boardwalk in Ocean City, Maryland, with my mom and my stepdad, and then my stepbrother and his best friend. And my stepbrother's best friend, they had their own condo, and my stepbrother's best friend was in the shower, and he called out to me. He was like, "Hey, go get me a towel." I don't have a towel. I don't know where my stepbrother was at this point. So I walked into the bathroom and I put a towel down, and it was one of those showers that has that clouded glass, and I could see that vague outline, that blurry outline of his body. And I was like it was like sparks were flying out of bolts on my neck or something like that. I had no idea why. It was a really singular and bizarre moment, this blurry outline. And in fact, I still jerk off thinking about that outline 20 years ago. It was such an intense experience. And so something woke up in me. I touched my body before that. I'd masturbated before that, but I didn't associate it really with anything. It was just like, oh, this feels good. It's interesting. It was just that. But then this whole new thing popped out for me. So this growth in us, this growth is like, it shows up through change and patterns. It's the expansion of change, like for me, this new change when I saw that blurry outline in that shower. And then a contraction into patterns. So like me jerking off to that guy in the shower like a million times over my life. I don't mean it's caused by the patterns. Just like leaves aren't caused by the patterns that are in them. It just takes its form that way, through expansion and contraction and change in patterns. So, we might begin to be attracted to a certain type of person as we get older. We might engage in certain sexual acts again and again. We might have sort of the things that we like. This is the movement of sex through our lives. It's the unfolding of who we are as sexual beings. We don't actually get to see the whole plant until we die. And I doubt that most of us think of it on our deathbed. I'm not sure, oh, that's who I was as a sexual person. But you don't really get the full picture until your time is complete. So how does this relate to sexual health? Well, as we grow, we can stunt or move along with our own growth. So again, with a plant, the growth isn't really stoppable. It's just sort of like, what kind of growth do you want it to take? So if you plant a dandelion in the forest, it'll grow up with these gigantic, exaggerated leaves. If you plant it in the light, it'll have these tiny little leaves. And if you plant it, and then pave over with cement, it'll still pop up very often. It'll break through that cement because you can't stop it from moving. but you can distort its form. You can distort its shape. So this is what happens with ex-gay ministries, for example. They see someone becoming a tree and they want them to be a fucking violet already, you know? They want to push it down and shrink it and change its form. And so all that gets rerouted, often in trauma in that case. Or, you know, you can find it in the movement to stifle pornography, I think, also reroutes these impulses to other places when we can't encounter sexual imagery. So, something we can do to work with our sexual health when it comes to growth is to this growth principle, is to give it light, as you give light to a plant, to give it light through awareness, through focus. So you can bring your focus and awareness to this. And also to enrich it with the right sort of feeling. So that feeling is love and forgiveness. Now, I know this is all easier said than done, but why do I say this? Because sometimes when we notice changes in ourselves, we panic, or when we notice patterns in ourselves, we panic, and we try to stifle it. And there's this saying that there is no way around but through, and that's very true with this sexual growth. So, like a lot of gay men I know, and myself included, as I get older, I find myself being finding an attraction to women, right? That was never there before. And for me, like, that freaked me the hell out when it first happened. And I know, I've talked to enough gay men now that I know that this has sort of shown up for them too, but because there's this idea of identity, there's no way to act out on it. And of course, the same is true for the heterosexual men many heterosexually identified men that I've made out with. This is what understanding sexual fluidity means. It's like this new thing shows up, and you bring awareness to it, and you say, okay. And it's also applicable in your relationships, right? You might start off open, in an open relationship, and then decide, you know what, we need monogamy now. You might flow into this sort of eddy or pattern of needing monogamy, and then decide, okay, but I want to be open. It's like a month later, and you've hated that. So you're like, I want to be open again. Allowing yourself to sort of cast light on these little worlds and give them a feeling of love. And then when it comes to enacting, what you would do with your body, when it comes to enacting these things, like enacting a new sex act or enacting sort of removing yourself from a pattern, if you're in it, you want to be removed from it, you can proceed or not proceed from a place of, oh, I've thought about this, I brought my awareness to it, and I'm okay with it, and I'm going to proceed, or I'm okay with it and I don't have to go anywhere. In other words, it becomes a choice and not something that you're doing out of compulsion. So the growth principle of sexual health, the growth principle of sex, it's the movement of sex through our lives. And it shows up as the expansion and contraction of change in patterns. That's all 19th century occultism, but it works here. So the next thing that you have on your sheet is feeling. To understand feeling is much less like a plant and much more like an animal. I mean, you can see the difference between a plant and an animal pretty obviously, and a lot of it is the way it evinces feeling. Sexual feeling is the intensity, the qualities and intensities we experience inwardly when we encounter the rest of the world. So, a plant has that growth principle, but not this feeling one. A plant can just stay perfectly still and it can grow. But as soon as you start moving throughout the world like an animal does, you can't help but wag your tail and like howl some of the time. It brings up feelings in you to begin to encounter anything outside of your immediate environment. And that's what happens with us sexually. Like, we encounter people and we feel an attraction to certain people. We encounter them and we feel sometimes a repulsion or a happiness, a sort of sexual happiness, which is a great feeling. Or you might come across a sexual act that really seems to turn you on. You don't know why. I have this weird, unexplored furry fetish thing that I've never done anything about, right? I don't understand it, and I don't know why the Easter Bunny should turn me on. That's next week, so we'll see. We'll see how that plays out. So, I mean, so you know what I mean when I talk about this. It's like sometimes you see somebody and you're just like, oof, like you feel that feeling. That's the feeling aspect of sex. And it's funny because it's so individualized that it's almost uncommunicable to other people very often. Like, I could point out someone that I think is extremely sexy, and my friend might be like, what the hell are you talking about, right? You've probably all experienced this where you're like, that guy, and the person with you has been like, what? You know, or if they're rude, they might be like, oh, gross, you know? It's very difficult, and the same thing with sexual acts. This is actually something that porn has sort of purified in my life. It's very interesting. That I'm getting paid to have sex with people that society says, these are the attractive people. So I get paid to have sex with them. And now I don't have an automatic reaction to those people anymore. But I noticed that there was an automatic reaction going on. So like, now if I'm at a bar and some dude with like huge biceps and giant pecs and that like xylophone abs like walks in, I don't have that feeling which I used to. My partner calls it prairie dogging, where you just sort of like, it's like meerkat manner. So like, I don't have that reaction anymore, it's gone. And now I find myself being attracted to the people that I'm attracted to. Sometimes they do look like that person, but it's not rare. I mean, it's rare, it's not an automatic thing, it's odd. So my feeling has been purified in a strange way. And more often than not, I find myself looking at the chubby, goofy-looking guy with big ears, right? That's standard for me. I don't know why. So what I'm saying is that this feeling, there's this inflow of forces for sexual feeling, and some of it comes from societal pressure. But then underneath that, what I've discovered is that there's actually, that's not all there is. There's also something else there. There's a core there to us, and that's also a mystery. And it's hard to communicate to other people because it's very, very individualized. And the same is true with sexual acts. So when we want to get into idea of sexual health about feeling, one of the best things we can do, I believe, is to understand that sexual feeling creates sort of a separation between us, and that we can bridge that separation through compassion. So so for example, like someone comes up to me and says they like being pissed on, and I'm not into that. But instead of thinking something like, oh, like this person must love being degraded, and this person must have had, like, I don't know, his dad must have peed on his foot one time when he was a baby or something weird like that. Like, instead of thinking those sorts of things, just saying, okay, that would be my interpretation of myself, but this is not the same for him, because these experiences are not relatable. It's too individualized. So when we extend compassion about sexual feeling, about this feeling aspect of sex, we're working against the current of our automatic reactions. And this goes a bit further. It's not just withholding judgment, it's also understanding that the same exact sexual act for me might not be healthy, and for you it might be healthy. So even if it looks exactly the same from the outside, when two people do it, it might have a completely different inner reality. And the only way you can find that bridge is through recognizing the other person as separate and extending a compassion to them. And the best thing about that, maybe not the best thing, but a really good side effect of that is when you extend compassion to others. In my experience, I've found that it creates an experience of compassion for myself and for my own things that sort of show up. Another thing we can consider in regards to health and sexual feeling, the intensities and the qualities we feel in our inner state, is to remind ourselves that sex is powerful and to not use that deceptively on other people. That the sexual feeling is very powerful. Like, look, we all walk around, like I have a dick in my pants, right? Like, I walk around with this thing all the time, or an asshole if you prefer. We walk around with this like thing all the time that's like pulsing, and everybody, like, at some point in the day, not everybody, but almost everybody, has this feeling of horniness, and so you walk through the day and you encounter these people, And you have this like force that we can sort of use on each other because there's this sexual feeling that's coming up, this content of sexual feeling. So, it's like, look at how strongly an animal reacts to stuff. I mean, when it's hungry, it'll just eat and eat. And when it's scared, it'll cower. And that's what our sexual feeling is like. It's that intense. And we carry that around with us all the time. So if you meet somebody who's like really attracted to you, and they're like, I want it now, I want it now, I want that right now, sometimes we abuse that when we come across somebody. I mean, I've done it, and I don't like implicating myself in that way, and I won't implicate everybody here, but I think we've had that experience. And if not, we've had the opposite experience where we deceptively did things for someone because we wanted them to have sex with us. We wanted them to find us sexually attractive. And I'm not talking about prostitutes or escorts where everything is sort of out in the open and the idea of the transaction is there. I'm talking about more deceptive feeling of there's this intensity, this powerful sexual feeling, and I'm going to use it. So engaging with the feeling aspect of sex responsibly, because it's a power that we all have. It is a sort of weird supernatural power that we all have. And handling it with care. So the feeling principle of sex is the qualities and the intensities we experience when we encounter others. So the last item there is thinking. Thinking is just concepts and ideas. I know whenever anybody separates thinking from feeling, I get kind of irritated because they are intertwined. These things aren't all intertwined, but I'm just sort of pulling them apart. Let me separate them out in an understandable way. I like to think that feelings are signals of thoughts. They're like an alarm for a thought showing up. So even though it sometimes feels like the feeling comes first, very often if we investigate our feeling, there's a thought underneath there. There's a concept or an idea, and that's what I mean when I'm talking about feeling. So what's an example? I'm going to give you an example of what I mean by that, and also an example of how we can interact with thinking for sexual health, all bundled up in one. So here's a common thing. Here's a common concept, that we're not supposed to think during sex. So that there's this concept that we're supposed to be totally immersed during the sexual act, that it's just supposed to sweep us away, and that it's supposed to be awesome. Our consciousness is supposed to merge with the other person in some weird 9-chakra lotus petal flower or whatever, and it's supposed to blow our minds, right? That our consciousness, our thinking should be obliterated. So then, usually what happens is we have a sexual experience and we're not totally immersed in it. And we start to feel anxiety, so there's that feeling. And if we investigate this anxiety, we find that underneath it there's a concept of, I'm not supposed to be thinking. I'm not supposed to be having thoughts now. Sex is supposed to be totally immersive. And the fact is, sex is rarely immersive sometimes. Even when it's intense, we can still have thoughts going on. And feelings will show up, and underneath them are concepts. Sometimes these concepts can be very painful. They can be like, I've had this one, my dick isn't big enough, right? Or I'm fat compared to him and he's noticing it right now. Or she doesn't know how to kiss me right. Or I don't really want to be here. I just wanted to hang out at home, but then I came out to this bar and now I'm with this guy and I'm back at this place and I have work tomorrow morning and blah, blah. They can get really complex. And so when that's happening, we consider sex to be bad sex. And something I talk about on the show a lot is that these thoughts actually, they're innocent. I mean, they want to help us in a way. They give us a chance to examine the sexual act. And the point isn't to get rid of them, but to notice them. So when we interact with thought in a way that's sexually healthy, it's important to understand that thoughts during sex are okay, that it's normal to think during sex, that it doesn't have to be immersive, that sex doesn't have to be perfect, because it usually isn't. And that makes it perfect, if you can think of it like that, some weird paradox. And in fact, a lot of times this concept leads to people participating in sexual acts that might not be the healthiest for them. Maybe they are, maybe they aren't. But sometimes we seek immersive sexual acts, things that will like take us out of our consciousness in an unhealthy way. Sometimes we ritualize that, and that is healthy. So there's a lot of people in the BDSM community that really know how to ritualize it. And that's why the BDSM community is really threatening to a lot of people, I think, too, because there's a power in ritual. People are scared of that power. I'm the most boring vanilla person ever, so I don't get in touch with that ritual very much. And well, I guess I make porn, so that's not that bad. But I like the basics done well, so I can't speak too much for the BDSM community, but I know that from the outside, people fear it because of that ritualized aspect. So what if, though, for us who don't know how to ritualize it, if when these thoughts appeared, instead of trying to stifle them, we just considered them and let them rose and fell and decided, I'm going to examine that later, or maybe I'll examine it within the sexual act next time a little bit. So let's take a common one. My dick is too small. A common one for me. My dick is too small. So we can take that thought and consider it afterward. We can hold it in a light. We can investigate it. We can talk about it with others if we want to. I'm talking about it with you right now. We can talk about it with others if we want to. That's pretty simple, but the key here is that we brought awareness to the concept. So we have a chance to let go of it if we want. Because the thoughts themselves are innocent. They want us to think, they want us to examine something about ourselves. It's our attachment to them that's a problem. So when we attach to them, we attach them unconsciously, but to bring awareness is to begin to sort of undo that knot a little bit. And then we start to see, the more and more we do that, that we can't control our thoughts showing up. They just show up. It's sort of like weather. You know, they pop up, they come and they go, and we can deal with them in our own way. So, I just said a lot. And I could talk so much more. I had like 20 more points about each item. But here's another thing about sex, and even in the sex-positive community, I found this issue a little bit. When I've given talks other places, that sort of thing, is that we tend to form pictures of sexual health that are totalizing. And sex is so intensely individualized because it's a matrix of all these forces, and they'll enact themselves in different ways in all of you. So what I want to do is, not tell you what health is. I've told you some of my own ideas, and I want to use that as sort of a springboard for a discussion. So what I really love is if, not right now, just wait until I describe it all, I want us to be in groups of 4, and try to find at least 2 people in that group that you've never seen before or never talked to, or if that doesn't work because maybe this is a small community, I'm not sure. It's 2 people that you only know by first name, somebody that you don't know very well. So groups of 4 and at least 1 or 2 people that you don't know in that group. And I want you to just take these items there, and I don't want you to even necessarily agree with my definition if you don't want to about these. They're just sort of a principle to get us talking, and what I've said is sort of a springboard to get us talking. And I want you to talk about with each other, and you can write down as well, because there's some space on there if you have a pen, and I think Jordan, yes, thank you. Jordan has done so much work for this. Thank you, Jordan, including bringing pens. Jordan has some pens there if you don't have one with you. You can write down stuff. And you can talk about your experiences with your sort of growth in sex, your feeling about sex, the kinds of things you're attracted to, your thoughts about sex. These principles, maybe we can stay away from the body aspect a little bit today. Because that's what you can get a lot of other places. Maybe not enough, still not enough. You still can't get enough other places, but here we're going to try and focus on something different. And so, not using what I said as right or wrong, maybe you disagree. Start working on forming a conception of how sexual health relates to these items. And then when we're done, we're going to talk about the talking that you did. Does anybody have any questions about that? Okay, so I'm going to give you guys like 15 minutes. which is not enough time, but all right. So try to meet with groups of 4 with at least 2 people. So you might have to get up and move away from the person you're sitting next to and talk about these concepts in sexual health.